Good afternoon. I'm going to call the State Board meeting to order. President Kirsch will be here shortly, but we are going to proceed. So I'd like to start with a salute to the flag. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. State Superintendent Torlakson.
Madam President and members, good to be back. This is a big day. A lot of hard work, a lot of thoughtful work, a lot of detail work went into bringing us the ESSA plan today, so I'm just going to keep my remarks short and allow you all to deliberate the details that have come forward in this final product. I thank the public for their involvement, their good ideas, their patience. I think it's good we've had this additional meeting to make sure everything got circulated and aired as thoroughly as we wanted to. So again, we thank the public for their participation. Can't say enough about the CDE staff, the state board staff, the teams, Karen and David, Marguerite Reese, Glenn Price, Cindy Kazanis. We went back to Washington. We had countless meetings, countless negotiations, and we did meet as we went back to Washington. I was in one of the trips, part of that team. We met with Secretary DeVos. We met with legislators on both sides of the aisle who had different opinions about the budget and policies, and we felt we had a good hearing with them. While we disagreed on some issues and some interpretations of federal statute, we appreciated the federal government's feedback and responsiveness as we worked to clarify and strengthen our ESSA plan. Our plan, as you know, we know, it is grounded in California's local control funding formula, which emphasizes local control, equity, stakeholder engagement, accountability, and continuous improvement. The plan before you today retains those principles and heads us in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you, State Superintendent Torlakson. So I see some friends out in the audience. So I just want to, I think former board member Ida Molina is here. So we wanted to welcome you, and Brooks Allen, our former member of our staff. We thank you for joining us today and for being part of our work in this process. So I want to make some announcements. Spanish interpreter services will be available. And so for item 1 on the update of the development of the Every Student Succeeds Act. Board members, letters from the public on matters before the board were aggregated and are filed in an electronic folder sent to you by State Board staff last week. We appreciate the public's continued cooperation in emailing all meeting-related correspondence to the SBE office at sbe@cde.ca.gov by noon on Friday, immediately preceding the board meeting. Board members, the meeting can be accessed via a fully electronic agenda, and there is one full print copy located in the lobby. I want to remind the audience that speakers should sign in at the table just outside the room. There are binders on the table with separate pages for our item number. We have one item today. Signing in on the page identifies the item number, and so please remember that it's 1 minute for speaker, and then 3 minutes for a group of 5. Also remind you that if you want to submit any written materials, please provide at least 25 copies to Pam Castleman, who's sitting right here in the front row. Please don't give any information directly to board members. And then reminding all speakers to introduce yourself and the organization you represent prior to speaking. And remember, speakers, that brevity will be greatly appreciated. You don't need to repeat comments that have already been made, and if you agree with the previous speaker, you can let us know that. Also, additional seating is available in room 1103 and in 1801, although I think we still have some empty seats here in our audience. And board members, just to remind you to turn on your microphones when speaking and off when you're not speaking, and speak into the microphone so your comments can be properly recorded. And if you need to recuse yourself, please do it before any discussion. So at this time, we're going to ask staff to come forward and begin the presentation on item 1.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be before you again. No, better? This side. Hi. Good afternoon. Okay, good. Good afternoon, Vice President Strauss, Superintendent Torlakson, members of the board. It's a pleasure to be before you again to talk about the ESSA state plan. As indicated in the opening remarks, I will provide information related to Item 1, update on the development of the California State Plan for the Every Student Succeeds Act, approval of the revisions to the state plan for resubmission to the U.S. Department of Education. As the board takes an additional look at California's ESSA Consolidated State Plan, I will spend just a few moments reiterating the foundational elements of the Every Student Succeeds Act, the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESSA. ESSA maintains the original purpose of ESSA, equal opportunity for all students. The Act ensures that disadvantaged and high-need students receive the same educational opportunities as their peers. A hallmark of the 2015 reauthorization is the increased emphasis on local control. ESSA grants much more authority to states than under its predecessor, No Child Left Behind. It is worth noting that many of the accountability provisions under the ESSA are fundamentally different than under NCLB. States have additional latitude to create their own systems of accountability based on multiple measures of student and school performance and achievement. Interventions and support are now driven by state and local efforts, paralleling California's local control funding formula accountability system. In many ways, the principles of the Every Student Succeeds Act complement California's efforts to increase our resources and attention on continuous improvement for all student groups. ESSA funds comprise roughly 3% of California's education budget. California's total kindergarten through 12th grade funding from the 2017-18 California Budget Act is $92.5 billion. State funds comprise $55.4 billion, local $29 million, and federal $8.1 billion. California's ESSA allocation is a portion of the total federal funding amount, approximately $2.4 billion. Of that $2.4 billion, $1.8 is reserved for Title I, the majority of which is allocated to local educational agencies. California continues to be committed to ensuring the ESSA Consolidated State Plan simultaneously meets the federal requirements while allowing for the full implementation of LCFF. State plans submitted in September 2017, January 2018, and the proposed revisions provided for the board's consideration today each outline the steps taken to develop an integrated state, federal, and local accountability system. As previously indicated, the work to integrate the revised federal requirements are grounded in the principles of the LCFF, which empowers local communities to make local decisions to address local needs. Throughout the plan development process, the board and the majority of stakeholders have been in agreement on this point. Letters to the board related to this item reiterate this foundational belief and confirm that stakeholders are eager to move towards implementation. Following the action taken to approve the ESSA Consolidated State Plan at the September 2017 State Board of Education meeting, California submitted its application in September of last year. Peer reviews took place in late October and early November for just 3 sections, Title I, Title III, and McKinney-Vento. From the date of submission, the U.S. Department of Education had 120 days to review states' plans. In late December 2017, staff from the State Board of Education and the California Department of Education participated in a conference call with staff from the U.S. Department of Education, or ED, in order to review ED's interim feedback letter. Prior to the January State Board meeting, the CD hosted a public in-person and webinar meeting related to the proposed revisions to the state plan from the accountability sections on January 9th. Staff walked through the areas of feedback from the U.S. Department of Education and described the proposed modifications to California State Plan for approximately 100 meeting participants. During the January State Board meeting, CDE staff presented to the State Board a revised version of the state plan based on the content of the interim feedback letter from ED. The SBE discussed and approved the revised ESSA state plan for submission to the ED, with a revision to replace the proposal related to the identification of the lowest performing schools with revised language indicating that the State Board would consider a proposed state plan supplement at its March 2018 meeting for submission to the ED that further described their approach. As you will recall, states were permitted to submit their ESSA state plans in either April or September of last year. As of today, the Secretary of Education has approved 37 state plans and Puerto Rico. It is worth noting that no states were immediately approved upon submission. All received at least one round of feedback. California's approach is somewhat different than those recently approved September submission states, in that the state board weighs in on each draft of the state plan. Throughout the state plan development process, State Board and CDE staff have worked together in what has been a highly collaborative development process shared by our two agencies. Following the January State Board meeting, SBE and CDE staff worked in partnership to find ways to seek final plan approval that continued to honor the tenets of the LCFF while also moving expeditiously in order to shift California's focus towards implementation. Through conversations with both approved states and pending states, we learned that most had gone through multiple rounds of back and forth with ED in order to tentatively agree on approvable language in their respective state plans before providing a formal resubmission. With this information in hand, staff members from the SBE and the CDE reached out to the U.S. Department of Education, and a small delegation traveled to Washington, D.C. in late February to discuss the outstanding areas of feedback related to the January resubmission version of the state plan. Included in the team were David Sapp, Deputy Policy Director and Assistant Legal Counsel, State Board, and Cindy Kazanis, Director, Analysis, Measurement, and Accountability Reporting Division, CDE, who will join me at the podium in a few moments to articulate the proposed changes to the state plan. Staff met with a group of senior officials from the U.S. Department of Education, including Jason Botel, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, and continued conversation for the days and weeks leading up to the March board meeting. Officials from the U.S. Department of Education indicated they were willing to explore innovative approaches for the implementation of the ESSA related to their remaining areas of concern, but only within their reading of federal statute. Staff from the federal and state agencies worked together for weeks and discussed potential language that will both meet ED's interpretation of federal statute and continue to align with the California way. Based on the conversations with staff from the ED, the CDE and SBE staff proposed to make the revisions to the state plan included in the March and April, today's, meeting agendas. The proposed revisions maintain the core principles of California's approach to accountability and continuous improvement, which is based in the LCFF and reflects the extensive stakeholder input received over the past 2 years. Many of the changes are technical in nature. However, some substantive changes are necessary to address ED's interpretation of several ESSA provisions. The proposed language in the item reflects the changes the CDE believes need to be made in order to have an approvable plan. Based on our conversations with ED staff, the CDE is confident that if the board ultimately adopts the revisions before you today, the Secretary will approve the plan. The CDE hosted an ESSA accountability stakeholder meeting on March 7th to review the proposed changes to the state plan, and nearly 70 stakeholders participated in the webinar. In March, the State Board approved 3 technical changes to the state plan and announced their plans to hold an additional meeting on April 12th to consider the remaining revisions related to Title I accountability. Like previous board meetings, the CDE and SBE staff hosted an ESSA stakeholder meeting, both in person and via webinar, to provide stakeholders with a detailed overview of the content of the proposed revisions to the state plan. Approximately 80 individuals participated in the stakeholder meeting on March 29th. On April 4th, the Assembly Education and Senate Education Committees held a joint information hearing on the California System of Accountability and Continuous Improvement, which included presentations from both State Board and CDE staff on the development and the status of the ESSA state plan, as well as the system of continuous improvement and the monitoring of local educational agency outcomes. As of today, today, we are gathered here for the board's additional meeting to consider proposed revisions to the ESSA state plan. Pending the action of the board today, the CDE is prepared to submit the ESSA state plan early next week. Once submitted, we are optimistic that the U.S. Department of Education will approve our state plan fairly quickly. We anticipate receiving a notice of approval in less than a month. Today's recommendation for the board is in 2 parts. I will read them for you now and repeat them at the conclusion of our presentation. The CDE and SBE staff recommend that the State Board approve the revised state plan for the submission to the U.S. Department of Education, pending the State Board of Education Executive Director approval, of final revisions requested by the State Board and corrections of any typographical errors. We have found a few as we have reviewed the state plan yet again, and I will mention that in the March meeting materials, in the addendum, there were some data tables provided that are not in the proposed draft before you today, so those drafts that the public has already seen will be included in the submitted version. The second part of the recommendation is that the CDE further recommends that the SBE delegate authority to the CDE, subject to approval of the SBE Executive Director, to pursue as expeditiously as possible so that can be resolved prior to the release of the 2018 California School Dashboard, a waiver of ESSA statute for the English Learner Proficiency Indicator, to allow California to maintain the current calculation that includes reclassified students and long-term English learners. There are 5 attachments related to this item today. Attachment 1 includes an overview and summary of the accountability-related items the board will consider, and a matrix of ED's feedback cross-referenced with the page numbers of the state plan beginning on page 8. Attachment 2 provides an additional summary of the proposed revisions to the state plan and was developed after conducting several stakeholder discussions and meetings between the March State Board meeting and your meeting today. Please keep Attachment 2 handy. My colleagues David Sapp and Cindy Kazanis will join me in just a moment to present the Title I accountability systems, and they'll use Attachment 2 as a resource for their presentation. Attachment 3 is the ESSA state plan itself, inclusive of the proposed revisions. This is the same version that was presented to the board as item 4 of the March meeting agenda. Attachment 4 is a resource provided at the board's request detailing the state plan approval process with the U.S. Department of Education and request for waivers. And Attachment 5 includes statute excerpts from the Title I accountability sections of the Every Student Succeeds Act. Thank you for bearing with me as we got through all of those slides. And as I mentioned, my colleagues will now join me at the podium and describe the proposed revisions using Attachment 2, and we'll begin with Dave Stapp from the State Board. Thank you.
Good afternoon, David Sapp, Deputy Policy Director and Assistant Legal Counsel for the State Board of Education. Before we move into the specific issues, we actually wanted to cover 2 overarching issues that have come up over the last month of stakeholder feedback that Marguerite referenced just a moment ago. The first has to do specifically with the scope of the proposed action today. This item relates to the federal Every Student Succeeds Act state plan. So far, the board has had separate agenda items on ESSA and our state accountability system. So the action today is limited specifically to the ESSA state plan. There are some references in the agenda materials, and this is where the questions came up about what happens to the dashboard, which is part of the state accountability system. And Cindy's going to come up and actually talk about some of those specific examples in more depth. But just to clarify, and this is consistent with the public meeting law in California, the Bagley-Keene Act, the action today is limited to the ESSA state plan. The board has previously approved an annual review process for our state accountability system, which includes any updates to the dashboard, where basically every fall prior to the next release of the dashboard, the board would make any recommended changes to update the way the indicators are calculated or what indicators are included in the dashboard. So to the extent the board takes the recommended action today, which does include some proposed adjustments to existing indicators, there's going to be an opportunity consistent with the board's prior action under the state accountability system to hear about those and ultimately take action as appropriate related to the state accountability system. So the good news is there's also time for further engagement with stakeholders prior to making that final decision in terms of any impact on the state accountability system. But staff did feel it was important to identify the potential implications of the action today on the state accountability system, but are not asking for any action at today's meeting on the state accountability system. The second issue is related, which has to do with implementation. There are, just to go back to what the ESSA federal law itself requires, again, the board is taking action on the state plan. The elements that are included in that plan are dictated by the federal law. There are quite a few additional requirements of ESSA that aren't covered by the ESSA state plan, that the state has to implement those even though they aren't covered by the state plan. Beyond that, there are also a number of questions, because it's a state plan described in general, how are we going to implement things? It is not required in the state plan to spell out every single detail about how we will implement some of those. So there are a number of implementation issues. We understand and expect there may be some questions today about those. But again, just wanted to note that for the purposes of today, which is focused on Title I accountability, pretty much everything that we're talking about is contingent on the next release of the next round of data, which is tied to the 2018 dashboard. So that'll be later this fall. So we actually will have 6 months between now and sort of when ultimately this is implemented for the first time, again, to have robust stakeholder engagement and further discussions with the board as appropriate on any of these outstanding implementation questions. So moving on to the specific issues, as attachment 2 lays out, there are sort of different buckets of these proposed revisions. I'm going to start by talking about status and change. And this particularly includes the sections of the state plan related to long-term goals and indicators within the ESSA state plan. As background, under the federal law, there are 3 required indicators that states must address in the state plan and also must set long-term goals for those indicators. And they are the academic achievement, which are the English language arts and math assessments, graduation rate, and English learner proficiency. In the course of the development of our system, we had our indicators that are a combination of status and change. In the discussions with the U.S. Department of Education, they had a more limited interpretation of these statutory provisions, that these required indicators can be based only on current year data. So that's sort of in the discussions with the U.S. Department of Education, that's what came through. So to briefly summarize the proposed revisions, they are to treat the status and change components of our existing dashboard indicators on these measures as separate indicators for federal purposes. So what this means is that status would be the required indicator and change would be an additional indicator which is allowed under federal law to be included in the accountability system, and the goal will be set relative to status. What we found out in some of the stakeholder discussions is it's easier to explain this with an example. So if you look at page 5 of attachment 2, this is the slide that we've replicated from that attachment. What this shows is one of the existing 5x5 grids that the board has previously approved for the dashboard. In this example, it's graduation rate. So this is identical to what the board has previously approved. And if you look at it, basically what the proposed revisions do is the vertical axis on this slide is status. So what the proposed revisions are is that we treat status as an indicator, and then the horizontal axis, which is change, we also treat that as an indicator. The cut scores for the 5 levels of status and the cut scores for the 5 levels of change are identical. The way that status and change combine to provide a color using this 5x5 grid also is identical to what the board has previously approved. And essentially, we combine those 2 indicators to give us a color just as we have all along. So the important thing, and this is an area where there was some confusion, is that the color that is produced by combining status and change is what we use for accountability purposes. So we'll get to the issue about school identification in a moment, but what we're talking about is continuing to use the dashboard color as the thing that's used for school identification purposes. So identification of schools is not based on status only. It is actually based on the combination of status and change and the dashboard colors that schools receive. The other implication of this relates to the goal. As I mentioned, the goal has to be set relative to the required indicator. And as I mentioned, the status component is that required indicator for federal purposes. So what that means is that the goal is proposed to be on this, it's the 3rd row down, the high status is where to reach the high status, which is 90% or higher for graduation rate. Under prior versions of the plan, which the board had approved, the goal was proposed as the cell that is the high status, which is that 3rd row down, and the maintained for change, which is the 4th column from the left. So essentially, if you look at this, it's the cell that has 71 parentheses 5.2 green. That was the goal that the board had previously approved. And the 4 cells that are in the very high status, which are blue, and the 2 cells immediately to the left of the goal, in this case it's a green cell and a blue cell, met the goal. So basically the goal is to get to that high maintained cell or the cells above and to the right of it. So the only way to meet the goal under prior versions of the plan was to be in the high status. Or put differently, there was no way to meet the goal without having at least a 90% graduation rate. So the practical implication of this revision for purposes of the goal is also not really significant because the goal is now to reach the high status. Under the prior versions of the plan, the only way to reach the goal was to be in the high status. So that's the basis for staff's conclusion, which is noted in the agenda materials, that do not believe that these proposed revisions materially affect in any way any of the existing accountability system or what the board has approved up until now. So again, just to summarize the key takeaways of what I just described, as a result of the proposed revisions, the implications are that there are no changes to the 5x5 color-coded grids that the board has already approved for the relevant dashboard indicators. Those remain unchanged. Second, we use the color-coded performance levels on those 5x5 grids, which are based on the combination of status and change for school identification purposes. So again, in prior discussions, prior versions of the plan, we were looking at the color-coded performance of schools as part of the school identification. That's exactly what we're doing under these proposed revisions. And finally, the goals for these indicators are not materially different in practice because it's essentially you have to be at the same status that you had to be under prior versions of the plan as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Cindy to talk about the two indicator-specific examples.
Thank you, Dave. Cindy Kazanas, Director of the Analysis, Measurement, and Accountability Reporting Division. And I just reflecting back, since this is, I think a bit of a special day for some of us, reflecting back actually the last 6 months, if Barbara Murchison was here, I'd say the last 2 years, but unfortunately she's actually at another engagement, is that it's been truly a team effort. I was very honored that the superintendent asked myself and I was able to accompany the team to Washington, D.C. In February. It was really a very interesting and very telling conversation that we had with the U.S. Department of Education. We've had a tremendous amount of collaboration. You should be very proud of your staff. I'm very proud of my colleagues for the tremendous amount of effort we've made to get to this day. I think Jenny and her team must have done 100 simulations just on this 5% issue. So I know everybody tends to focus on that particular issue, but there's quite a bit more in this plan than just labeling schools. So with that in mind, I also was reflective on the fact that I came to this department in 2003 with the former administration, and the first thing that we had to do was to help implement NCLB. So my role was actually the liaison to the State Board of Education. So we met, you guys met rather, every month that year. It was painful. And in the meanwhile, the accountability division, of which now I'm director of, was trying to make tweaks to the academic performance index. So they had these two very different systems. And so I think as I look back on the last 15 years here, what I've taken forward for these last 6 months is always thinking about implementation in mind. I'm not just trying to get a plan approved. I'm very cognizant that this plan means impact on our work. It means impact on the work we've already launched over the last several years with your guidance on our new accountability system. So we're trying to make this as aligned as possible with the current system. That being said, we do have to follow some rules that the U.S. Department of Education and the Congress has set forth. And so the things that you're seeing today are a culmination of all of these efforts. And so the other thing I wanted to mention is, in order to prepare for this meeting, one of the things we were asked to do was to provide you an information memoranda that was published on March 28th that told you what our timeline was for the next 6 months. So Jenny and her team, and actually other colleagues within our division, Jonathan Eisler and Tom Bjorkman are my other managers, are all prepared to meet several benchmarks. We're going to come back in May and ask you to do things on alternative ed. We're going to come back in July and we're going to be talking about several measures to get us to that finish line for the release of the dashboard in early December. So I am so looking forward to today because I'm hoping that we can move to this work plan and perhaps move along and stop focusing on a plan that has not yet been implemented, whereas we have things that we are implementing now and trying to implement in the dashboard. So with that, I also wanted to make sure that that you are aware that we are ready to come back to talk about implementation. I think Dave sort of talked about that we will be having a conversation about what does this mean for the dashboard, these items that you are looking at today to approve. And we're prepared to do that as early as July. May is a little quick. We actually have a couple other things on our to-do list for the May meeting related to our state system. But we are prepared to come back, assuming that the U.S. Department of Education approves it and pending your action today. So with that, what this proposal would do for grade 11 is incorporate grade 11 test scores into the academic indicator for purposes of gearing towards the school identification. It would retain grade 11 test scores in the college career indicator and use it as an additional indicator for purposes of the Every Student Succeeds Act. So with that in mind, let me see. I wanted to mention that the grade 11 is really an important part of the college career indicator. So we are not suggesting that it be pulled out or be removed. It is something that only helps schools to show progress on getting their students prepared for college. So one of the ways to look at what the academic indicator would look like in the dashboard is actually something that we're already doing. We're already showing the raw scores for our grade 11 students because you've asked us to do that, and I think stakeholders have wanted it for both the beta version of the spring dashboard as well as the fall version. So what we would do is we would simply, fold that in to the academic indicator. If you're a unified school district, you simply see more scores because you would be adding in your grade 11 students. If you're a high school district, of which we have many, they would have, for the first time, have an academic indicator with performance levels. You also asked us back in March when we said we were going to try to schedule this meeting to bring alternatives. And so one of the alternatives that we are suggesting is that the state board could limit the use of the indicator for only purposes of school identification, and that would mean no changes to the dashboard. Moving along to the other item-specific or indicator-specific issue is related to the English language proficiency indicator, and this is one that I feel a bit more confident about. It's had a lot of stakeholder input. In fact, we've had a work group that met starting approximately 2 years ago to deal with this issue. And so there's been broad stakeholder input and consensus, and I think input from you all too on what you expected to see in this indicator. It was very clear during our negotiations that this the language that we have included as far as reclassified students in this was what ED did not feel like met the measure, or rather the merits of the statute. They were, I would say, very open to a waiver. There is not any guarantee, of course, of that, but that is one of the reasons why the department is recommending that with your actions today of approving the plan, that you subsequently authorize us to submit a waiver. And we are prepared to begin that public process pending your decision by bringing it to the California Practitioners Advisory Group, which meets in approximately 2 weeks. So with that in mind, we also wanted to say what happens if we don't obtain the waiver on this particular indicator. If that were to occur, the English language proficiency indicator would be calculated differently, potentially differently on the dashboard. The state board could also use a modified calculation for, again, school identification purposes only. I think it's important to also remind you, and I'm sure some of you are very aware of this, that this fall we will not have a color for this indicator because we have transitioned from our old assessment for language acquisition to our new assessment, the LPAC. And so there are some things that, some steps you need to take first, and we need to have a second year of scores before we can actually calculate a color. So the immediate impact may not be for another entire school year, but we wanted to keep with the momentum and, of course, move forward with requesting that you consider requesting a waiver to submit to the U.S. Department of Education.
David Sapp, State Board staff again. Before we move into school identification, there's another issue noted in attachment 2, which is weighting of indicators. So as a result of the proposed revisions that Cindy and I have just described, the number of indicators is larger than it was in earlier versions of the draft, because we're treating status and change as two distinct indicators. So instead of having 7 possible total colors, the total number of indicators is larger. So there are a number of proposed revisions that are technical in nature to the sections about weighting of indicators to conform to the earlier revisions about the indicators and status and change that we discussed. It's not on the slide, but realize that it should note that as well. On school identification, just really quickly wanted to note the sort of what ESSA requires again before we kind of go through what the proposed revisions related to school identification are. ESSA itself requires states to identify multiple categories of schools for different types of support. So we're going to talk about 4 of them here. The first is the one that I think has gotten the most attention, which is at least the lowest performing 5% of Title I schools. Those schools, districts must provide what's called comprehensive support to those, or LEAs must provide comprehensive support to those schools. So the second category is high schools with a graduation rate below 67%. Similarly, LEAs must provide comprehensive support to schools that meet that criteria. I'm going to talk about the differences in support in a minute. The third category is moving into this, looking at the performance of student groups within schools. The first 2 are based on overall all student performance. The third category is any school with a, quote, consistently underperforming student group. And that's something that states in their state plan must propose a definition for consistently underperforming. So that's one of the areas where there's a proposed revision. For those schools, LEAs must provide what's called targeted support, which is different from comprehensive support. In the fourth category, and this is where it gets a little complicated, so I'll try to make it as clear as possible, is basically any school that has a consistently performing student group. So any school in category 3 where that student group is at a level of performance that would get it in category 1. So basically you look at the student group performance at a school that's been identified for targeted support and see if that student group's level of performance on the relevant indicators is basically on par with the lowest performing 5% of schools overall. So you're looking at how does an individual student group performance compare to overall performance of the lowest performing 5% schools. If that student group is at that level of performance, that school must receive additional targeted support, which is a little different than general targeted support. So again, this is what Congress laid out in the law. So I apologize if it's confusing. It's not my choice. So the difference between the different categories of support, comprehensive support is basically where the district and the school are required to develop school improvement strategies, and ultimately the state education agency, so ultimately must come up to the board, must take action to essentially sign off on those strategies, and then there must be some state level ongoing monitoring of what's going on in terms of implementation of those. Targeted support is different. In targeted support, the school must develop a plan. Both of these are in consultation with stakeholders, must develop a school improvement plan, and the LEA must approve it. There's no state role as far as approving the strategies for targeted support. So that's sort of the different categories of support that we're going to touch on briefly. For all of these, at the most recent meeting in January, several board members suggested under our state system, we identify local educational agencies for assistance. So couldn't we make the case that because we've identified districts that collectively serve way more than 5% of Title I schools, and we identify districts based on student group performance, that we've already met these requirements? In our conversations with the U.S. Department of Education, they made clear that their reading of the statute is that ESSA requires states to identify individual schools based on specific performance criteria. So therefore, identification of LEAs cannot serve to meet these requirements for school identification and support under ESSA. So we actually spent a fair amount of time going back and forth and discussing that with them, but they were very clear that under their reading of the statute, that would not meet their reading of the statute. So the proposed revisions, I'm going to start with the lowest performing Title I schools. The first is to propose specific performance criteria for schools. I think looking back on some of the discussions that we've had about this requirement, there's been some discomfort in reaction to this arbitrary 5% number, which is really sort of a holdover from NCLB and is very different from our approach under the local control funding formula. Under the local control funding formula, the board set performance standards, which are objective performance standards that we apply to local educational agencies and look at student groups. And if they meet those criteria, then those LEAs receive differentiated assistance under our state accountability system. We aren't looking at a particular number of districts. We're looking at objective performance criteria of students, and that's what drives whether that assistance is provided. So under the proposed approach, which is different from some of the prior discussions where different options were presented, you may recall that prior discussions talked about we can add color combinations until we get to that 5% number. What these recommendations propose is something different. It's more aligned with the approach under LCFF, which is a set of objective criteria that will apply to schools. And if a school meets those criteria, then they are eligible for comprehensive support. There are actually 4 different criteria to account for the different possible number of dashboard colors that schools can receive, because depending on how many students they have, they get differing numbers in grade spans, they get differing number of colors. But to summarize, the criteria are essentially if 50% or more of the colors are red, or if all of your colors are red and orange, a school is selected. Based on data simulations to date, this gets us at least 5% of schools, Title I schools statewide, which is what ESSA requires. Looking at the fall 2017 dashboard data, it's roughly about 6.2% of schools would meet these criteria. You know, big caveat there is that those numbers will be different for the next dashboard because we have different indicators becoming available, as well as the proposed revisions to the state plan looking at grade 11 for high schools. So the numbers may be different, and this is something that the board, that there will be a lot of technical work to review that, and this may be something that comes back to the board to tweak based on what those updated data show. So the takeaway in terms of the implications for this and why staff feel comfortable recommending these proposed revisions is that in general, I think there was some question and discomfort about whether this 5% of schools number was incompatible with LCFF. I think there probably was a way to address it that would have been, but under the proposed approach, staff do not believe that this is fundamentally inconsistent with what the board has already approved under LCFF for 3 reasons. The first is, under this approach, the local educational agency remains the locus of responsibility for supporting school improvement, because consistent with ESSA, the LEA is responsible for working with the school to develop a strategy. So this is not just a school plan developed in isolation, but it can be implemented in a manner where the district remains responsible. And there was a reference in the agenda materials that this actually could be implemented within the existing local accountability plan process. I think several board members have expressed previously, we expect districts to be looking at their school level data already, so that this is essentially consistent with that expectation, because based on the performance criteria, these are some schools that require some extra attention. So we believe this can be implemented in a manner that is consistent with that expectation within the existing local accountability plan process. The second benefit is that as a result, it can be implemented without a separate bureaucratic school improvement plan. So it's not something that necessarily has to be created from scratch, separate and apart from the existing stakeholder engagement discussions with school communities. It can be incorporated as a part of that ongoing discussion around local accountability plans. And finally, and this is, I think, different from some of our past school improvement efforts and the discussion about the system of support, this has come up, is that very often those school improvement strategies were just sort of in isolation and not necessarily tied to a broader sort of district strategy. If this is incorporated within the existing LCAP process, that would ensure that the school level strategies are aligned to the overall district goals and programs and services identified in the LCAPs that the district is adopting. So we do believe there's a way to implement this that really complements the existing LCAP process and isn't something totally separate and apart or fundamentally at odds with what's already underway. The second category was the graduation rate. The proposed revisions here are pretty minor. The earlier versions of the plan said that a school would meet these criteria if the grad rate was below 67% in 3 consecutive years. The proposed revision is to say a 3-year weighted average below 67%. So it's essentially, instead of looking at 3 years separately, we're looking at them in the aggregate for selecting these schools. And similar to what I described earlier, because this is comprehensive support, this can also be implemented in a manner that's consistent with our existing district-based approach under LCFF. And then quickly on targeted support, The proposed revisions really focus on the consistently underperforming definition for student groups. And again, that's one where the state has to adopt a definition that's then used to identify schools for targeted support. And the proposed revision is to look at whether that student group or any student group at a school site meets those objective performance criteria that we're using to identify schools for comprehensive support in 3 out of 4 consecutive years. So that timeline, 3 out of 4 years, is a timeline that exists under state law, under LCFF, for technical assistance to charter schools and also state intervention for local educational agencies. So it's sort of aligning with that timeline. And also, I think consistent with the definition itself, consistently underperforming, looking at multiple years rather than just a single year of performance as the criteria for selection. And then because of the proposed definition, any school that has a consistently underperforming student group would be eligible for additional targeted support, because by definition, that student group is at a level of performance that sort of meets the standard for that type of support. And again, there's a way to implement this because ESSA itself contemplates that the district is responsible for approving the plan, that we believe this can be implemented in a manner where the LEA remains responsible for the planning and support of the school district. So it's not shifting away from the district focus of LCFF.
So we're still working off of attachment 2, and the next slide after this will give you the full table that is on page 9 of attachment 2. But the measurements of interim progress, or MIPS, is something that I think is pretty benign. It's something that you have actually already approved. It simply makes us put the arithmetic in the plan for our schools and districts. And so what you will see on the next slide is an average calculation of the annual progress needed to meet the long-term goal by our student groups, as well as this midpoint status check. So this has no bearing on school identification. This is simply a reporting function required under ESSA. But you can see, again, those last 2 columns are something that is new. The other thing I wanted to point out is in a previous version, we had listed our student groups that have already met the goal are Asian, Filipino, 2 or more races, and white. We had listed as maintained, and the Department of Education asked us to change that language because all student groups need to continue to improve. So that language now is listed as increased from baseline. So we will continue to monitor these progress as required under the reporting requirements. But again, this is not used for school identification purposes. The last issue is around N size, and while we've adopted a 30 student threshold for the calculation of a color, the ED has said that we also need to make sure that we are looking at our schools and our districts who have fewer than 30 students in those groups. So this is requiring us to put together a review of that data. We had contemplated incorporating it into our compliance monitoring process and found it to be not a good fit. So we still have some work to do on how we're going to actually implement this, but what we have committed to doing is reviewing the data for those about 120, 130 schools that have fewer than 30 students on any dashboard indicator, and seeing if there are trends, if they are in need of support, and providing them technical assistance. There is also a removal of a reference to the alternative school model, which you will take up for the first time at your next board meeting because it's still under development. We actually don't know what to say in the plan at this point because you have not taken any action on what is included in that model. So that is the other piece that is sort of just left over that we wanted to point out. So with that, I will turn it over to Marguerite to do the recap.
Thank you. So I've already read the recommendations for you today. I'm happy to toggle between the 2 slides. I should also mention that for the working draft agenda for your May meeting, there is an additional ESSA state plan update. So we will be prepared to give you an update at that point, and hopefully we will be able to celebrate the approval from the U.S. Department of Education at that point. So at this point, turn it back to Dr. Kirst. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to apologize for Karen and I being a little late because we were in an urgent meeting with Governor Brown. Let me make some comments about the situation at this point, and then we'll go around the dais and ask for clarifying questions giving each person a chance, and then we'll have the public comment, and then we'll have a chance to go around again for more questions. So as we all know, we've been waiting on this ESSA plan and working on it really for over 2 years. And so it's really, time now is really getting urgent for us to take some action. Delaying any vote will jeopardize the flow of the money because it has to go through the budget process in California, and we couldn't really respond in time, I think, for the budget process to take it up. So, you know, we're in a point where we would negatively impact the state budget planning process. I do believe that we have had the best deal and before you that we could make with the government. They really cited statute and their decisions on statute with all other states. On the other hand, we were able to integrate this with our state and local accountability effort. There's lots of misinformation out there, I think, on what is going on. I think this presentation was beautifully organized and very clear, but a lot of people still have a no child left behind mentality in their head and think that some of these things trigger actions similar to what was under No Child Left Behind, and that's not true. A great deal of what we discussed with the department was around what we must report on websites in the CDE, and so I think that we need to spend some communications time on clarifying what is in the recommendation. So with those preliminary remarks, I'm going to start on this side with Board Member Holliday for clarifying questions, and then I'll start on that side with Board Member Rucker for the questions after the comments. So Board Member Holliday, you have the floor.
No, I'm good, thank you.
Go ahead. Jaden, if you have a comment.
I'm good as well, thank you.
I thought the presentation was very clear and helped summarize the key things that we are focusing on today, so thank you. I don't have any further questions at this time.
And I'll repeat that. It was really well organized. I appreciate that. And in addition, I appreciate the Dave and being able to meet ahead of time and go over the issues and what was being changed and why it was being changed. And I feel like probably the rest of the board that we're very well prepped.
I have no technical questions. Again, also to thank the state board staff and the CE staff for all of their hard work through holidays, through all of this to get us to where we are. Thank you.
Board Member Strauss.
Well, I did have two clarifying questions. One, my understanding on status and changes, we're not going to change the way we're doing it in our plan, but we're going to report the two things as separate. Is that right? But we're not changing the way that we're evaluating the performance of our schools. Is that right, Marguerite?
Yes, that's right. The plan itself will have to change to describe how we're going to report status and change as separate indicators, but in terms of our work with the state, how we evaluate schools, that will not change.
Okay. And the second clarifying question I have is on attachment 2, where we're talking about the interim points of progress, and so could you clarify that? For me, it had some, it felt like a little NCLB stuff on it. So it did feel like that. So I know this was an example, and if we approve it, you have some plans to, could you just clarify that?
Sure.
Please?
So of course my colleagues can join me if they have additional comments to add, but as part of the negotiations with the U.S. Department of Education, one of the things that they requested is that California essentially do the math for the public and provide the difference or the interim measure between where you started, where you are in the middle, and where you will be at the end of the goal period. Previously, we've just shown the beginning and the end. And so we essentially just did the calculation of where you would be at the end of year 3 or the start of year 4 at that middle point between the 7-year goal. And so one of the things the board will need to consider in the future and looking at how the state plan will be implemented is exactly how that is displayed, but currently it will need to be a part of the LEA report card going forward.
And the column on the attachment 2 says average annual improvement, but you're saying this is just taking where we want to be at the end of 7 years and then dividing it by 7 and then doing the calculation so it helps LEAs have a sense of where they're going.
Exactly.
But that there will be a follow-up LEA report card that will elaborate this.
So, I mean, we gave one example, but the LEA report card will show that across the appropriate indicators as well.
Board Member Burr.
So I'll just echo what my colleagues on the other side of the dais said about appreciating how much work has gone into this. And I sort of have a question, I think, along the lines that Board Member Strauss was pursuing. It's not clear to me what the consequence is of being identified. So if you could clarify that. And then the second question has to do with grade 11, that I think, Cindy, when you presented what the options were, one of the the only option I think I saw was that you could treat it differently for purposes of ESSA versus the state system. But is it also an option that we could ask for a waiver of grade 11?
So why don't we answer the second question first?
It's always an option that you can ask for the waiver. We need to, in the state plan, articulate how we would meet the current reading of the statute. So that is why the recommendation is stated the way it is, because that is something that the ED has, we've negotiated with them. They have agreed that that would meet the reading of the statute for including as in the academic indicator. But there's always an opportunity for this board to ask the department to move forward on other waiver options.
Okay.
You had asked about the measures of interim progress and sort of, so what are the consequences of that? It is truly a reporting function. There is no role in this in the identification of schools. So the lowest 5%, this is not part of the calculation. It's simply a sun-shining of the data, if you'd like to put it that way. Others may think of it as shaming schools that are trying to make progress who aren't continuing to make progress as being in that same vein.
Board Member Ortiz-Lacombe.
I thought I didn't have comments, and then I was wrong because I think one of the things that I have pushed for are these MIPS that we're calling. And, I do find it a little interesting that we want to narrow achievement gaps, but we don't want to see them. That's ironic, and it's something that we really should reflect upon, because if we can't see them, we can't address them. But my question to you would be a statement in attachment 2, and I want to confirm that we are committed to California. We'll continue to use a California school dashboard for state, local, and now federal accountability purposes, accomplishing the goal of creating one integrated system. Is that still our commitment? Is that our commitment?
Certainly the commitment of the Department of Education, and I turn it over to the board I assume it's still the commitment of your board, but of course that's your
Okay, I want to make sure that that is still our operating value as we move forward in this conversation. Thank you.
Mine might be mine might be a little bit more technical, but just 3 quick questions. One, the timeline that we're talking about, the 7 years or the 3 years, starts when, if this goes forward? I mean, is it going back to 14, 15, and we're already in year 4? Or?
It would start in fall of 2018 would be
Okay,
the first.
that's what I thought. Okay. And then with the English learner removal of reclassified and the LTELs, there has been comments about we would be able to get that information out of LPAC instead of, could you just clarify that for me just so that we all are understanding that, as opposed to not having it as a waiver item? No?
Let me try to make sure I understand your question. So the state plan requires us to look at students who are currently English learners. So that is what the recommended changes to the state plan would do. So it puts forward a proposal that we are deleting the reference to our reclassified students. The plan actually never reflected your action back in September of the long-term English learners. We weren't able to align that submission. So I think I may have confused you by introducing yet a new topic, which is operationally come this fall when we release the 2018 dashboard, we will not have a color for our LP. And that is due to the fact that we have switched tests. And since a major component of this whole indicator is the acquisition of English and seeing where they are scoring on our English language development test, that is a critical component. This board needs to take some actions on the assessment side in order for us to then use that information on the dashboard. So we're trying to figure out the transition, and we'll be coming back to you for what your thoughts are on our recommendations for that. But that is more just, again, on the state side, operationalizing this. In general, we're in a transition period already, even though we've only had really a full year of a dashboard.
Board Member Rocker.
Well, I want to add my congratulations as well as my praises to the staff and in both the Department of Ed as well as the State Board staff. It's invisible to the public the amount of work, the amount of scholarship and research and collaboration with a lot of state entities that goes into doing this work and putting this plan together. So I really do commend you for the effort. It was a Herculean effort, not just because we were outside of the box in our thinking to implement what we've done so far with the LCAP, but in trying to take advantage of what we believe is that flexibility and at the same time implement the requirements under the federal mandates in a narrowly constricted or narrow and very constricted interpretation of how the mandates are supposed to work. There are a couple of questions I do have, and they're focused on the school intervention and support. David did a great job of laying out the types of identified schools that would be under the comprehensive support. And he said the board has to define the strategies for that comprehensive support. In adopting this plan, is part of that adoption include the board's action to write that definition, or is that still something that has to be done separate?
So the ESSA itself, as I mentioned, the state plan and the sections, what's required in the state plan is based on the law that Congress passed, and there's certain information that must be included in the state plan. There's no requirement, and there's actually no place in the state plan template to provide specifics about the school improvement strategies and what that requirement will be. That's actually it's not a required, and there's no place to actually do it in the state plan. So that's actually an implementation question. The law itself does spell out some very certain things that must occur. So for example, I alluded, and I think this may be Member Burr's question about what happens for identified schools. For those comprehensive support, they have to develop essentially a school improvement plan. There's no definition or description of what that must be, but it must include certain elements. It must involve engagement with the school community, for example, has to look at the data. I can pull the statute to be more specific if you'd like, but there are certain, basically a needs assessment of sorts, and then describe certain strategies that are evidence-based. That's more or less what is required. And then ultimately, there needs to be a sign-off by the local educational agency about that strategy and that plan. And then for comprehensive support, as I mentioned, ultimately that has to come up for sort of sign-off at the state level. That's not the case for the targeted support schools. That stays at the district level.
Stop there. Yeah. All right, so I think that's part of what, I had the same question as Board Member Burr about clarity on what happens when the schools are identified. So I understand that while there is no requirement to write out or to lay out what the plan is or what the definition will be, I believe for guidance to the field and for the locals that are looking at this, because they ultimately will be identified, by the time we get to the point of identifying schools, I do think separate from approving this plan, if we could have that conversation and figure out what those next steps are, or even say in the timeline you've given us where that conversation would occur, I think that would be helpful.
I can answer that very specifically. The reference in the materials that staff have noted, potentially the LCAP as a process to do it. I think we need to have some further discussions with stakeholders once the board has taken action, so we know the parameters. But there is a process laid out in statute for the board to consider revisions to the existing template for the LCAP. The board, in particular, in the LCAP summary, there are some very specific prompts that the board previously approved looking at LEA level data, where if you are in a red or an orange on any specific indicator. So I think that's the sort of thing we'd like to be able to have some conversations with stakeholders. And then ultimately there would be, it would have to come back to the board if it relates to the LCAP template specifically, because the board would have to approve any changes to the existing LCAP process or the template itself.
Okay. And then the second question I had was on the targeted assistance. And I just think I blanked when you were explaining. There was something concerning the targeted assistance that had to be defined as well, or that had to be laid out or enumerated. Could you repeat that? Because I lost that sentence.
So it's specifically the definition of a consistently underperforming student group that's determined by each state adopts a definition for what that is.
And that's a board action separate from approving the plan as well?
No, that's included in the proposed revisions as defining that consistently underperforming student group as where the student group in 3 out of 4 consecutive years has the level of performance of that overall lowest performing schools.
Thank you. So the third thing I had, and this is my last comment, David was very clear, and I appreciate, David, the way you clarified this, because a lot of people don't realize there's a difference between what's in the ESSA plan and all of the other mandates that are enumerated in ESSA. I think it's really important, separate from this plan, that we lay out what other requirements contemplate or require board action to implement. For example, the plan does talk about some changes in the report card. There are some other required changes in ESSA in the report card that are not included in this plan, so that people have an overall picture, not only about how the report card will change for accountability purposes, but what else is going to be included in there. So my concern is that we're separating the ESSA planning components from the rest of the work that we have to do on implementing ESSA, so that people at some point are going to get ESSA fatigue if we never get to a point where we're done implementing the mandate. So I think it's important that people see at some point there's some confluence in the two sides of the ESSA work that we're doing on the implementing.
So I would say that CDE certainly agrees with that point. And
ESSA fatigue?
No. I would never say that. But on looking towards implementation, and CDE staff have been focused on, once the state plan is approved, how we can display that information in a way that is usable for the public.
Yeah, okay. I think we're ready now for public comment. We allow 1 minute, and groups of 5 can get 3 minutes. So clerk will call the roll, the group of respondents.
Will the following people please line up? Michael McCormick, Cynthia Glover Woods, Melissa Romanos, Letitia Garcia, Naomi Dimcully, Isaiah Hernandez, Beth Meyerhoff, Ashley Lutenheiser, Doug McRae, Angela Ball, Michael Flores Castaneda, Dean Drescher, John Effelt, Misha Cabal, and Eric Adams.
Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Michael McCormick, Superintendent of the Val Verde Unified School District. Good afternoon, President Kirst, Superintendent Tom Tarlickson, and members of the board. I'm here today on behalf of education leaders in Riverside County, which includes our county superintendent, Dr. Judy D. White, and 22 other school district superintendents. First, we thank your staff and department for working to draft a plan that balances the need to comply with federal requirements with the need to remain faithful to a multiple measures accountability system focused on the continuous improvement of instruction and services for students. We understand the inherent conflict that ESSA's requirement to identify the lowest performing Title I schools creates for the accountability system that we've been working hard to build, but we believe that the plan you are considering today focuses on the more important issue of ensuring that these schools are assisted through a comprehensive system of support. Maintaining the locus of control and improvement at the LEA level rightfully recognizes that schools reside in a broader ecosystem of district, regional, and state infrastructures designed to ensure their success. We continue to have concerns about using only the status component for our state indicators for ESSA reporting purposes. The two-dimensional architecture of the dashboard is the foundation of our continuous improvement system. As local educators who have spent the last 4 years building both awareness and trust in our communities, we are concerned that public reports focused on status only will regress us to the static proficiency model of No Child Left Behind. We understand that ESSA explicitly requires the use of current year performance data. In the absence of a waiver that will allow us to use both status and change for federal compliance, we ask that you, with local education leaders, figure out how to best display ESSA-required reports while maintaining the public prominence of our performance and growth data on the state's dashboard and any other public platform. Finally, Riverside County leaders urge the board to maintain the college and career indicator as an accountability measure for both federal and state purposes. We fully understand the inclusion of the 11th grade test scores in the CCI and now academic indicator create a double counting issue. However, we are convinced that the benefits of maintaining the CCI as an accountability measure greatly outweigh the double counting concerns. We view the CCI as an important measure of equity in our larger education system because it explicitly and implicitly acknowledges that students can and do take many effective paths into post-secondary life. And we want to continue to honor their choices as well as encourage our system to expand the multiple pathways for student success. In closing, Riverside County leaders support the state plan you are considering today as a way to secure federal funding for programs that serve our students. We thank you and your staff for maintaining the fidelity and vision to the core and architecture of California's continuous improvement system. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Isaias Hernandez with the Mexican American Opportunity Foundation, a nonprofit organization that services over 100,000 families in 6 counties in California. We believe that California should be a leader in educating millions of Latino students here in California. However, the draft plan before you does not answer all the critical questions that students, parents, and communities with low-performing schools have about how the state will invest in and implementing the school improvement process. We understand it is a work in progress, but urge that the state fill in the missing essential details and stop expecting the students and parents to be patient while time slips away. The plan needs to clearly address how the state will implement school improvement strategies. Communities deserve to know what is going to be done when schools are failing to serve Latino students. How long is it going to take, and what will happen in cases of consistent low performance? Not only do we deserve to know, we deserve to be consulted and allowed to have the input in the plans for school improvements for our kids. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Beth Meyerhoff, California State PTA. California State PTA, representing more than 750,000 members, is already on record supporting the federal expectation and staff recommendation that 11th grade SBAC scores be reported as standalone measures of academic progress. We see this important indicator of school success as a valuable addition to the dashboard. The SBAC scores identify achievement gaps that must be addressed. California State PTA thanks the board members for creating a single approach to school and district accountability. We appreciate the genuine commitment to helping all stakeholders fully understand the state's ESSA plan elements. We look forward to continued stakeholder engagement to provide input as the dashboard and other elements of the accountability system continue to evolve. California State PTA remains committed to the goals of equity and transparency as we all work to help the children of California succeed. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Michael Flores Castaneda, representing the California Teachers Association. CTA strongly supports the waiver request and would like to thank the board for continuing to ensure a single accountability system in California based on multiple measures and continuous improvement. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Doug McRae, retired educational measurement specialist from Monterey. I submitted a brief set of observations on weighting and school identification issues to your electronic folder last week. Bottom line is that there is a more efficient and understandable way to do identification of schools for both comprehensive and targeted support under ESSA. An approach, in my view, far more consistent with federal statutory language and generating cleaner identifications from a good educational measurement point of view. However, in the spirit of compromise, I suppose the colorful status and change wedgie charts method recommended by staff is doable, at least for the near future until complaints from the trenches rise to an untenable level. For more detail on the more efficient method, see my observations in your electronic folder. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Ashley Lotzenheiser, Parent Revolution. We work with public school families, primarily in historically underserved communities throughout California. Many of those families have addressed you over the last couple of years on the dashboard and ESSA plan. They aren't here today, but they were in front of the LA School Board on Tuesday, where they were instrumental in the passage of a school performance framework in LAUSD. We support the use of Smarter Balance scores for 11th grade as a standalone indicator on the dashboard. Parents need to have this information so they can determine how well high schools are performing. Also, we appreciate the proposal to identify the lowest 5% individually, regardless of LEA. On this, we do want to emphasize that parents need to know that comprehensive support is implemented with real accountability and linked to a credible timeline. We are skeptical that this can happen through updates to the LCAP template. Many of the parents in our network have children who attend schools that have been chronically underperforming for decades. So as you move forward with the initial identification of schools, please consider strategies that can be implemented with urgency on this front. Thank you.
Good afternoon, President Kirst, members of the board. I'm Dean Drescher on behalf of EdVoice. I'd like to echo what my colleagues at Parent Revolution just said. And I'd like to thank you, Board Member Ortiz-Licon. We share your concern that it seems like we say we want to narrow achievement gaps, but we don't want to see them. And on that note, we believe Smarter Balance scores for 11th grade should absolutely be the 11th grade academic indicator for high schools as required by law. Academics are important. Regarding the identification of the lowest 5% of schools, we urge the board to clarify exactly what California will do to help students in the lowest performing schools. And we also encourage you all to engage with the governor regarding the May revision of the budget to address exactly how ESSA's Title I 7% set aside will be used to help kids and to address the achievement gaps that were obvious in the most recent NAEP scores out this week. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, Andrea Ball here today on behalf of the California School Boards Association. Terry. We recommend that you do approve the state plan. We want to extend our thanks and appreciation for the delay and allowing more stakeholder outreach that the board staff and the department staff did between the March meeting and today. We think this is a workable solution. We do recommend and urge you to request a waiver on the English language proficiency indicator immediately. We understand getting the plan in is important, but this is really a concern without getting that waiver. CSBA concurs with including the 11th grade assessment scores and the academic achievement indicators. It's been a long-standing position of the organization and concurs with this revision. We think it is a workable solution, the way that the plan is written to identify the low-performing schools and really continue the focus on the districts as the point to really ensure they work with the lowest performing schools. Finally, CSBA is happy to help get the word out, communicate a better understanding of the plan and the requirements. Thank you.
Good afternoon, President Kirst and board members. John Effeld from Public Advocates and the Equity Coalition. We're appreciative of the effort here to maintain a single system of accountability and try to work out the differences with ESSA and stick to a California approach. That said, we think it is an improvement to have included the interim goals and have sunshine in the process so we know how schools are doing and districts are doing along the way, and also the addition of the 11th grade SBAC scores. Supportive of the waiver motion, and so happy to see the board move ahead with that. And it's really time now to turn to implementation. We have a number of recommendations on implementation. I'll call out one in particular. We want to see educator effectiveness folded more tightly into the system of support work going ahead. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Mish Kabal, and I'm representing Youth Together. We're an educational equity organization that basically teaches young people how to organize within their school and community. Kind of reiterating what other folks have said before about it's great to be able to identify the lowest performing schools, but what is the strategy and how we're going to engage our stakeholders? That we need community accountability and who is able to hold the district accountable if they aren't engaging their stakeholders through LCAP. I also appreciate that the low-performing schools are being identified through a 3-year lens rather than just each year individually. My hope is that we are able to involve stakeholders in making long-term decisions and solutions for these things. I think there's a lot of disconnect with the district and community members, especially within Oakland right now. So our biggest thing is how do we teach our students to be able to engage with their district members, to have them know that our students want the best solutions for their schools, considering that they're the most impacted. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Eric Adams, and I'm also with Youth Together. I'm one of the site organizers, and I wanted to talk about the intention to improve the California dashboard. I appreciate that we're looking to add 11th grade SBAC scores as one of the college indicators, and I think it's really important, especially for low-income communities, to have extra indicators of whether or not they're being served well enough to matriculate in higher education. I want to encourage us to continue and to do more community engagement to make sure that it's actually legible. For example, in Oakland, the community members have a chronic history of a lack of social capital in engaging with their community elected officials, and there's a history of elected officials not being as forthcoming with information. So I encourage you all to make the dashboard not only as legible as possible for those who have the least capital, but also for it to include relevant resources that go beyond just the indicators and create opportunities for parents to engage with the district on a level footing so that they can actively be partners in supporting their students with teachers.
Good afternoon. I'm Ephraim Mercado with Children Now. We really appreciate all the work that's been done by the state board staff and CD staff to negotiate with the Department of Education on the ESSA plan. We do believe that it should be adopted today. A couple of quick notes. I will reference our letter that was sent in. While most of those are implementation issues that we'd like to really kind of go into, and as Dave said earlier, a lot of stakeholder engagement will be necessary on those pieces. Two specific pieces. On the LP indicator, we agree that we should seek a waiver. Our policy for our state is great and it is better for our kids, so we should really think about that. But we would not support our waiver on the grade 11 assessment. We feel that it should be within the system because it is the only academic achievement indicator for all kids across the state. So we look forward to the work moving ahead, or moving forward twice. Yes, sorry.
President Kirst, I'm Brian Rivas speaking on behalf of the Education Trust West. We're recommending that you move on from the ESSA state plan, and some good work has been done pursuant to it, but really you're getting to what a lot of us think is the most important part of this work, and that's improving districts and schools. When we talk to communities about the various accountability requirements, they want to know what happens when we're identified as in need of assistance. How long is it going to take? What role are parents and communities going to play in identifying solutions? So we'd urge you to move on to that work and move on with a sense of urgency, because that's really where the public needs you and where students need you. I'd agree with what some of my colleague, Mr. Affelt, said about integration, and by that I mean look for opportunities to integrate various pieces of what you're doing pursuant to ESSA, like monitoring access to effective teachers, and integrate that with work around the LCAP to improve instruction in academic programs.
Good afternoon, Marta Alvarez on behalf of AXA, the Association of California School Administrators. I'm here today to support the staff recommendation to both submit the revised ESSA state plan, and we strongly also support the recommendation to pursue a waiver on the ELPI criteria. We really are pleased to see that the state board and city staff moving now to the work and hopefully this plan being adopted by you today and being approved by the federal government to really focus on supporting and building capacity of school leaders, on teachers, really where the work happens every day to support kids and their education. With that, we urge the state board and city staff to continue communicating with the field. We at AXA look forward to helping out with any tools, resources to be able to clarify to the field what this plan means in terms of accountability. With that, FAQs would be great. Some of the questions that were asked today here at the board would be great for the field to have to understand what ESSA means in terms of our state accountability system. Thank you.
Katharina Gargana on behalf of California Association for Bilingual Education and Californians Together. We strongly support the CDE staff recommendation to request a waiver for the ELPI indicator to include RFEPs and LTELs. We believe it is critical that these two groups are included in this indicator to accurately measure the progress of our state's English learners. Thank you.
Okay, that completes the public testimony. So before we go around the dais from that way, I'd like our federal liaison with me, Ting Sun, to make some comments.
Thanks, everyone. So I know that this has seemed like it's been a bit of a Goldilocks approach to arriving to where we are. We have too few schools, too many schools. So now at this point, I think we've arrived at a place where this criterion-based approach, while it may not be perfect, maintains the integrity of the California way. It uses performance levels on our developed dashboard for the identification of schools. It's consistent with our state law, and it is consistent with our expectations of what districts should already be doing at this point within their LCAP process to support underperforming schools. And it also leaves the responsibility of improving those schools at the LEA level, which is part of the framework of LCFF. So I would be in favor of the motion to approve this, to approve the staff's recommendation. And yeah, so I think, you know, I do feel that this meets the equity needs, and it does bring to light specific schools that need those resources and help and assistance.
Thank you. Okay, so now we'll go around from Board Member Rucker.
Well, I want to begin by saying to all the stakeholders who have come here today and who have been coming to the board meeting and having this discussion with us for the past couple of years, I want to personally thank you very much, because what you have done and the input you have offered, even if you're frustrated by the 1 minute, you have really informed our work. You've kept the conversation open. You've kept the model of what engagement is supposed to look like viable and real. And for districts that are still struggling to do this work and understand what engagement is, and even to gain traction on the types of improvements and the types of conversations that should happen in having conversation about understanding their achievement gaps and the climate and conditions and the conditions for teaching and learning that actually lead to improvement. A lot of that work has been incubated here. And I understand some of the frustration about what is not in the plan, because again, we have some of this ESEA speak that is still holding on to our thoughts about the ways that we should engage with the process of school improvement or school change. But there is a difference, and there is a mind shift and even a policy shift on what it means to do this type of work and the time that needs to be invested. So while we have talked for a long time about the arc of time that improvement actually takes, that is not what we saw under No Child Left Behind, because the arc was shortened to a year, and that arc, by the time we figured out how to meet the goals of that year, they changed the end post and the goals were pushed out a little further. But the frustration that I hear, and I do understand it and I do hear it, is that even though we have articulated how schools will be identified, there is some frustration that we're not being clear in laying out the path about what the intervention looks like. And that's because there is not, in the same way that we criticized ESSA for a one-size-fits-all definition of low performance, there is not a one-size-fits-all definition of the intervention, because the reasons for the underperformance and the needs for the intervention have to be allowed to take shape and be framed around those local conditions. So I'm really glad to hear from the stakeholders that the locus of control needs to remain at the local level, and that it's really important for the state to be the benevolent uncle that passes down the funds, that gives you a template within which to operate, but more importantly, gives you the freedom and the time in the arc of 3 years or a little longer to do some of that work. I also share your frustration about closing the achievement gap and naming the all. And that was my frustration for quite some time, because when you fail to name the all, you also fail to address those needs. I think the difference in this approach is not that we are not articulating what the achievement gaps are, but we are requiring in the work of developing the intervention plans and in the work of developing how the LCAP will operate to look at those underperforming student groups, the districts must name the all. They don't know, some of them are still learning how to do that, and some of them are still working on what intervention looks like. But I think understanding that achievement gap, while it's a question we have to live with and we're not comfortable, I'm going to choose to believe that we can trust this process, and I will trust but verify until I don't have a reason to do that anymore. So I'm very happy to see the work that's been proposed by this plan, and I agree with my friends from several of these advocacy groups. Let's move on from the conversation about approving the plan and get to actually doing the work. So thank you very much for being here with us today and continuing this conversation.
Board member.
First of all, I would love to take the opportunity to thank everyone, staff, members of the board, all of our stakeholders who are here today. And I play a double role of being a practitioner as well as someone sitting on the board. And so the decisions that we're making, I don't take lightly because I'm directly impacted by it in my day job. I appreciate that I am in support of these recommendations going forward, and I think it echoes what board member just said just a moment ago in terms of we need to move on and begin the work and not have confusion. And so as we go forward, some of the lack of specificity I think gives us in a sense some flexibility as we go forward and make some more detailed, thoughtful decisions. And I really think it's very important that we really continue to focus at the LEA level to make sure that there is a system in place and that there is sustainability and capacity built over time. So that's all I have to say today. Thank you.
Board Member Ortiz-Lacombe.
Thank you. I also want to thank the department and the state board staff and all the stakeholders, because it takes a lot of commitment to follow the process, stay with the process, hold us accountable, teach us and really highlight our blind spots when we're not seeing things that really matter in the field. This is the third time this plan has come before this board for a vote, and I've always respected the process. I do have experience seeing how other states are also going about this process and engaging stakeholders, and many states are not doing it quite well. So I've always taken pride in knowing that California has truly meant to have an engaging and inclusive process. So thank you to staff for doing that. As you know, I have not always agreed with the outcome, and mainly because I felt that I just couldn't live with that. But I'm happy to say that this version, I don't feel like I'm compromising my dignity, my integrity, my morality. It's a good first step for a lot of these things. I love that we are proposing a standalone 11th grade indicator. And I have to say that I think from the letters we received, we shouldn't see this as something that was imposed upon us, because this is something that I've heard throughout the course of this plan that Californians want. And if you look at our red folder, which is the way we get our electronic letters, there is consensus for a lot of what we're modifying here and proposing. I also like that we are shining a light, in not a punitive way, but in an informative way on achievement gaps, so that LEAs and schools can really get into the business of looking at all of their students and looking at their resources and trying to align goals, resources with the needs of their students. I would like to see this into one coherent system of accountability, and I know that we're not talking about the data dashboard. I'm looking at you, Dave Sapp, I know that. But I know that if we have one system of accountability, we also do need to be aware of what this means in terms of our dashboard, in terms of our one coherent system of accountability. So I look forward to having that conversation at length so that we could implement something that really brings the spirit of LCFF and the California way without sacrificing any of the true elements that makes this a system focused on equity. Thank you.
Board Member Burke.
Again, I just want to express my appreciation, as I did earlier. Sometimes Feliza and I come at this from different angles and are a little bit kicking and screaming to get to the end, but I'm there too. I do want to, I think it's important, and I really appreciate the creativity and innovation that the department and the board staff have displayed here in getting to this place to make sure that we do have an integrated system, and that it's focused, it's leading with the state system, not the federal system. So I just want to be clear about that. I do think, just going forward, two things. I'm really proud, as I know Superintendent Torlakson is, to be intimately involved with the work of the California Collaborative, because that's a lot of where the implementation is happening. And if any of you got to hear the conversation this morning, we're doing a lot of work with pilot districts. We have all kinds of networks that are working on this, and they're very focused on student groups. So I invite you to pay attention to what's going on with the collaborative. There's also a lot of conversation that's going on in the budget, both with state funding and now will be with federal funding, about how to support that effort. So I think it's not that we're not paying attention to it. We are, and it's already begun. In fact, I'll just say that we approved the hiring today of an expert in special education and for the collaborative to work with our Students with Disabilities Collective, Carla Estrada, who's a nationally respected expert in special education. So we're on it. I know it seems kind of slow, but we are headed in that direction. The last thing I'll say is that I do think I would like some clarification. We heard this a little bit from some of our speakers about what it means to use status for purposes of federal reporting and status and change for the state, so that there isn't slippage there, because I think there still continues to be a little bit of confusion. And I think we'll need some communication with the field that's very robust around that topic to make sure that LEAs especially understand that we do value progress. We're not just talking about where did you start. So later on, if you want to do that, Dave, but I just think that would be helpful. Thank you.
First, let me just say that I feel like we're moving down the pathway and we're staying the course. And I feel like that's been a commitment of all of our stakeholders, that we know we still have more work to do. We know we have some refinement. And the reality is we're very interested in implementation and what it means to move toward continuous progress. So I feel like the plan is a part of the process, and I commend the CD and State Board staff that actually went to Washington and spent more than 6 hours, which wasn't the only part of the process they had in communicating with ED, and I feel like you're trying really hard to find a win-win and keep the system coherent. I do believe that we have more work to do, and I know that our next State Board meeting, which is a month away, we're going to be working on system of support, and I think many of us are want to know more about what the specifics will look like for targeted intervention for the districts that have the most reds and oranges. And so I'm looking forward to hearing more of the details and kind of the meat on the bones of what does that mean. And so I appreciate what Member Burr is saying about the collaborative work, but I feel like many of us are ready to say, okay, we've identified it, so now what? So I just want to say that. I do have a couple of clarifying questions that I would ask staff to do when you come back up, and one is, what is the timeline for a waiver? Because my understanding is we have full commitment to continue with our English language proficiency indicator, but that we have to modify it for submission and then go for a waiver, and that the waiver has a whole separate timeline of steps. So because so many of us believe so strongly in the reinforcement of reclassifying English learners, I'm interested in how long that takes. I'm hopeful that at our May meeting we'll hear that our ESSA plan's approved, but I'd like to know what the timeline is on that. And secondly, I know that in the governor's budget there's some money for the revisiting of the dashboard and listening to stakeholders and doing some rethinking and kind of improvement, and I'm just interested in the timeline on once that goes through. Is that summer into fall before our new scores come out? So I'm just interested in sort of the next steps on that as well. So I just want to thank everyone who came today, who often come to all our meetings and add an extra meeting in your cycle to come and testify. It's not one thing to just send us a letter, but to be in front of us and sharing what your positions are and what the stakeholders and practitioners feel. I think that really helps to inform our work and reinforce that people are ready to move on, but with continued focus on some of the areas we've identified. Thank you.
Okay, Board Member Sun. Board Member Williams.
I'll keep this short and associate myself with many of my fellow board members' remarks. In particular, Board Member Ortiz Licon, I think you summarized it really well in your first few remarks about how you felt and about the process, and that resonated with me. This has been a long, arduous process. Both the state's accountability system and the ESSA part of it. And I can't commend the staff more, but the state board staff and the CDE staff, incredible, rigorous, tenacious work for a really long time. And I really, really appreciate knowing that we have staff that are that committed and that dedicated and that smart and that thoughtful. I also, along with my fellow board members, really appreciate the people that come up and tell us what they think. Even when I don't agree with it necessarily, but to hear so many viewpoints and many of you coming from such different perspectives, but it is so essential to us continuing our work and continuing to sustain ourselves in our work and to remember, oh yes, that's important too. Yes, that's important too. Let's not drop that. It's really, it has been for me, and sometimes very, very moving. And I will give you one reason why a 1 minute limit is of value, and it's not because it shortens how much you have to say. It's because, especially during this process, it has been so fatiguing that when you're limited to 1 minute, what I know is that you have told me the thing that is the most important to you. You have made sure that came out loud and clear. And it's been easy then for me to kind of make note of that time and time again. That's the thing that's important to that constituency or that person. So like others on this board, I want to thank you for sending the letters and for coming and helping us with our work.
Okay.
I'd like to express my gratitude to the staff members of CDE and the State Board for their continuing work on this, as well as our stakeholders who have really been true partners in this effort. And while, as Member Sun said, it's not perfect, I think it is really important that I'm in full support of all elements of the CDE's recommendation today, including the waiver. I think that's essential. I think that it also speaks to the fact that the California way is driving our system, and I look forward to continued conversations and work around our system of support and what that looks like, because we do have a responsibility to remember how this is affecting our students, our teachers, and our administrators at schools and in districts. And I look forward always to every meeting and how we're learning from what's happening out in the field, how students are being supported in new and innovative ways right now as we speak. So there is work happening, and this is an important milestone in continuing that work. So thank you.
Board Member Gray.
I just want to thank everyone for their work in shaping my education and the education of, the 6.3 million students in California. I think when you're in the classroom, it's kind of hard to fathom all that goes into education and the education system. But being able to be a part of this process these past couple of months and just seeing all the nuance and all that goes into it, it's extremely humbling, and I'm really proud. Thank you.
So the first year I was running a small public school in West Oakland, I remember clearly the day that my business director came to me and said, "Hey, Bruce, we've got this Title I money." I had all sorts of plans for how I could help the most underperforming students, and I had no money. And it was like Christmas that day when she came to me and said, "Here's this money. I hope that we approve this plan today. I hope the feds approve the plan, and I hope the money will flow to schools and districts and teachers and the kids who deserve it."
Okay, I want to make a final comment that the big thing for me to look forward to is that we have about $130 million in ESSA set-asides for supporting schools and districts in improvement. And the appropriation by the Congress was good and actually added some money. They added some money to Title IV, which is a block grant, which might enable us to do some more. So a big job now is to figure out how to use that money. And that is also part of the May discussion with the legislature. So we'll be working with them, but the board and the department will have much work to do on that. So I think that'll be a big challenge to figure that out. And that I think is a prelude then to asking Board Member Sun if you will make a motion.
I'm very happy to make the motion to approve the revised state plan for the submission to ED, pending the SBE Executive Director approval of final revisions requested by the State Board and correction of any typographical errors.
Okay. Okay, some clarifications.
Yes. I'm going to start with the easy one, the dashboard redesign. There is $300,000 in the governor's proposed budget for this coming fiscal year. That is not preventing us from already doing work on improving the dashboard now. We do have a prototype of the homepage that I showed you at your March meeting. We are moving forward with obtaining feedback from parents and other stakeholder groups on that new look and feel, and we are also starting to talk to national experts on data visualization on how to improve the webpage and the website as a whole.
And then I'll address the other two questions. First, the question about the waiver timeline. I believe, as Cindy mentioned, there's already work underway just to make sure that the department was able to move forward as quickly as possible. The requirement for us is that there actually be a period for stakeholder feedback on any waiver request, and that feedback be reflected in the submission. So I think as noted in the agenda materials, there's a good chance that we actually would be able to turn that around for submission prior to the May board meeting if the board does take action today. And then we move into the review and approval process by the secretary. By statute, she has up to 120 days from submission to make an initial determination on the waiver. I believe there are a couple of other states that submitted some narrow waiver requests sort of closely in time with their plans that were resolved well before that 120-day period had run. And then there is actually a further hearing process and review process if it's initially denied. But we believe that under the timeline, if it is submitted, if the board takes action today, we believe this could actually be resolved prior to the 2018 dashboard. Again, as Cindy noted, it may not impact this year, but to ensure that we know what that's going to look like going forward. The final question had to do with Member Burr status-only reporting, and I'm just going to go back through a couple slides to try to show my answer a little bit. So looking back to the measurements of interim progress slide, and this was sort of an example of how it might look in the LA report card, one thing that you will notice is that status change and the color are actually reflected here. So it's not, doesn't have to be status only, I guess is how I describe it. And then just going back to the slide about the implication of sort of treating these as separate indicators. Status, the vertical axis is the required indicator for ESSA that has the goal, but change is an indicator within ESSA. And the requirements for the report cards are that all indicators be reported. So we actually must include the data for the change component to meet that requirement as well. So I appreciate the public comment earlier. That's why it's so valuable and why we're happy we do have time for further stakeholder input. The question is how to actually present it in a way that makes sense, because this is just one of 14 required elements that Congress put into the LA report card, which also has to be concise. So, I think we have a lot of work to do, and I think we're most interested in hearing from parents and the public about how to present this information in a useful manner. So.
Okay. Yes, I think we're ready for vote. We have a motion and seconded. All those in favor, raise your hands. Okay, it is approved unanimously. So that, Board Member Sun.
I do have a second motion that we further recommend that the State Board delegate authority to CDE, subject to approval from the State Board Executive Director, to pursue expeditiously as possible so that they can be resolved prior to the release of the 2018 school dashboard, a waiver of the ESSA statute for the English learner proficiency indicator, and to allow California to maintain the current calculation that includes reclassified students and long-term English learners.
Okay, no further discussion on that. All those in favor, raise your hands. Okay, that carries as well. So we're now done with that item, and the only thing we have remaining is the public comment on items not on our agenda. 1 minute for public comment.
Doug McRae, please step to the mic.
Good afternoon again. Doug McRae, retired test publisher from Monterey. I submitted an extensive review of recently released Smarter Balanced technical material, responding to the lack of credibility of the 2017 consortium-wide gain scores sent to your electronic folder last week. Bottom line is the technical report released March 28th neither provides a smoking gun for explaining the non-credible 2017 gain scores, nor a strong case that there were no technical glitches that may be the cause of the stark consortium-wide gains, declines in gains. This leaves us with going into the 2018 Smarter Balanced testing season without information on possible changes in the operational item bank or the computer adaptive algorithm that may affect 2018 gain scores. The lack of transparency on these issues by Smarter Balanced is disappointing and very troubling. Thank you.
Thank you. No other public comment? If not, the meeting is adjourned.